a lot of people, for example, in the intelligence community, the foreign services, all of those people, is that, of course, the ruling Communist Party with which they have had historically the closest interconnections was the Soviet Communist Party. And I think they imagine that the Communist Party of China is like the Soviet Communist Party. As someone who studied the Soviet Communist Party, I can say that even I can see immediately that they are profoundly different from each other. The assumption that the one is the same as the other is simply wrong. Now, whether once upon a time, in 1950s, they were closer to being alike, I don't know. But today's CPC is profoundly different from the Soviet Communist Party that I remember. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Now, the second is about your very point about, Chinese popular attitudes. Now, I went for a relatively short space of time to China in 2017, to Shanghai. And of course, I don't speak Chinese. So there's a limit to how much interaction I could have with Chinese people. But my impression was very clearly that most Chinese people are very proud of the country's achievements, strongly support the government there, and are becoming much more critical of the West. And that was before the real crisis between the West and China started. That was in 2017. But already people were, and I think partly, and I'm going to say this also, it was partly a reaction to the behavior of some Western people in China itself. They don't always behave very well. I'm not going to go into the full details of that. But anyway, there was definitely, as far as I could see, already a sense, well, we're putting up with a great deal from these people. There's a limit to how much more we're prepared to put up with. What about Xi Jinping himself? What are feelings in China about him? I mean, he does seem to be very associated with the anti-corruption policies that you were talking about. One other thing I was told when I was in Shanghai, and it was not said to me by a Chinese person, but that he played a very big role, or was seen to play a very big role, in dealing with the air pollution problems, which were extremely important for people and which measurable progress was made. But do people think about Xi Jinping? Is he, I mean, I didn't see many pictures or posters of Xi Jinping. It wasn't a Soviet style personality cult or anything of that kind. But I mean, do Chinese people think about him? What are people's feelings about Xi Jinping, if they have any?
Yeah, well, when I was there, and it was for 2.5 weeks, I did have someone who could interpret, and I did, and I also was with a lot of people from around the West, mainly the United States, who also didn't behave always too good. But when I was there, even just in that period, it was interesting talking to people because they would talk about Xi Jinping as almost like a moderate, right? I think there's this idea that Xi Jinping in the collective West is viewed as like this communist authoritarian, radically shifting China. George Soros, right, says that Xi Jinping is basically the reincarnation of Mao, and that China is like the biggest threat because it's asserting this authoritarianism and ending reform and opening up. No one in China thinks that. I mean, I think the most politically astute people, those who are experts and who follow this kind of stuff in China, Xi Jinping is more of a moderate. He's more of a synthesis of various political trends in China. Xi Jinping articulates that very, I think, clearly in terms of looking at Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong and trying to put together the elements that are relevant for the current path that China is on. And so I think a lot of people think of Xi Jinping like that. They think about him a lot. I mean, I think that is something that, unlike in the United States, where our president is like a celebrity and he's always on TV. Well, Joe Biden, not a very poor celebrity at this point. He's no Obama, and certainly no Trump when it comes to being a celebrity. But nonetheless, that's how the media treats U.S. presidents. They're the figures, they're the figureheads. In China, it's a lot different. I think that there is an understanding that Xi Jinping is very important, but there's also an understanding that the whole system that they are forging forward with is actually what is the driving force here. And that Xi Jinping is just a really good leader. They see him as a really stable leader, one that has been very successful in navigating a very difficult world situation and also a very difficult situation in China, where it is hard to be a sovereign country on this planet with the external threats, but also to achieve certain markers really, really fast, because Chinese people are into doing things as fast as possible. Like there's no let's wait around like in the United States or the West. Let's wait around for like 10 years to address pollution. No, Chinese people wanted pollution addressed in the 90s, and they wanted it done the day before. So that's the kind of, I think, feeling in China. It's like when there are problems, people want them fixed fast, and they want their government to do it as fast as possible. And so they see Xi Jinping as being successful in rapidly addressing these problems because he was the one who placed the issue of the climate, right? The massive industrialization of China had consequences. Smog, pollution, people were getting sick, and people still are getting sick to a much lower degree. But the success is there. China has reduced pollution more than any other country. When I was there, that was the conversation, right? You would see some levels of smog in Beijing, and then people would tell you, yeah, well, if you visited here 10 years ago, that would never leave the sky. And it's because when you go around, you see the state-directed investment in this kind of policy, right? Planting more trees, redoing how getting rid of diesel. We were told straight up that you cannot have a diesel car in Beijing at all. Like you have to get rid of it, and and the government will help you get a different car because electric vehicles are very expensive. The United States doesn't understand that, so that's why nobody has them in the United States. They're very expensive. You have to help people get them because who can afford, a six-figure car? Not only rich people. So yeah, that's the feeling with Xi Jinping, is that he is a representative of this overall trend in Chinese society, and it is very positive. But at the same time, there are still many challenges, and so actually, I think Chinese people really value the moderate side of Xi Jinping, that the pragmatic side, that it's not some kind of militant going back to the past of this, like George Soros wants us to believe, but it's actually trying to do whatever is needed to keep China stable and to keep China growing and prosperous and meeting its objectives, like around the environment, but not sacrificing, right, anything. In the US, it's always third world countries, global South countries, oppressed countries. They need to sacrifice for the climate. China doesn't say that. China says, no, countries need to develop. They need to have economies that meet people's needs. But, we should be addressing pollution. We should be addressing, the devastation of the natural world. Why not, right? They call it the ecological civilization. You need to. We want lush, mountains and waters. We want that. We don't want our environment to be destroyed. But, I think it's a very moderate approach. Things happen fast and very significantly, but it is a balance. They say harmony all the time. Xi Jinping says it all the time. There's almost like this Confucius philosophy that has entered into the Communist Party of China's ideology. And I think that's because there's a balance here. You can't go 100 steps forward, and you also can't go one step backward, right? And that's the expectation of Xi Jinping. And they obviously, Chinese people support him because he can take it. He can take it, and the party under his leadership can take that kind of pressure.
Absolutely. Can I just say again, I mean, one of the things that if you go to China, you very quickly realize is, again, how very little people actually know about modern Chinese history and how quickly they forget. When people say Xi Jinping is the most powerful leader China has had since Mao Zedong, well, what happened to Deng Xiaoping then? Has he just been deleted from history? I mean, you never hear anybody talk about him anymore, which I think in China they do. And if we're talking about Chinese people's perception of their modern history, I did a very unusual thing when I was in China, which is that I went to the tomb in Nanjing of Sun Yat-sen. I know I'm not pronouncing his name correctly, by the way. But anyway, I went to the tomb of Sun Yat-sen and I was astonished at the number of people who were visiting his tomb. And by the way, they were astonished to find a Westerner there. And I mean, that was, I mean, and very, very welcoming, I should quickly say. But the fact that I was there with my wife was something that clearly they were not expecting. And given how important Sun Yat-sen is to the modern history of China, that is in itself remarkable. Danny, I'm going to hand over to Alex in a moment, but I want to ask you one last question. What do you think is China's greatest problem? I mean, where do you think the problems in China are at the moment? Is it in the economy? Is it in the financial system that we hear so much about? Is it the property bubble? Are all these things connected in some way? Where do you, if there is a weak point, where is it?
Wow, that's a good question.
That's a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean,
Mm.
just listening to how Xi Jinping speaks and what Chinese media says, it feels like the biggest vulnerability for China is in the economy, and I think that it is in preventing the kind of speculation that you see in the collective West, right? I think that is its biggest problem because it takes a lot of reform, and it's a very delicate balance because on the one hand, you want, right, China is a majority state-owned banking system. So that allows for these problems to be taken care of quite rapidly. But they're constantly springing up because they want to spur investment. They want people to be investing in the private sector. They want that to happen. And they want that to happen in the sectors that are most attractive to people, and one of which is the housing market. So I do think that is the biggest problem because one of the things that China really wants to resolve in this next period, in this next 13-year period that it's cited to be actually modern, socialist modernization, there's still a gap between the rural areas, a big one, and the cities. And one of the reasons for that gap is because the Chinese government, the CPC, wanted to encourage industrial development and heavy economic development in the cities, right? It wanted to develop the urban areas rapidly, and it did so by focusing more on the development of urban areas. That has balanced out a lot, even just in the last decade, but there still is a big gap. And so one of the things that China is going to need to figure out is its residency system, right? That has caused problems, right? Trying to figure out how do you populate the cities? You have to plan this. You can't just have people migrating from the rural areas and living in before the development has been achieved. And so balancing that is going to be a big priority because housing prices have gone way up in Chinese cities. Now, because of the banking sector, that can be mitigated by friendly loan terms, by the state-owned banks. And that's why you don't have the homelessness problem in the United States. But people are discouraged. You had a situation where people in China had mortgaged apartments that hadn't been built yet, and the private company in charge of that just wasn't building them. And so they were actually prepaying these mortgages without any possibility of moving into the places that they hoped to move into later. And so that was clamped down on. So I think that's a vulnerability because it's going to be a problem that's going to be ongoing because there is this desire still to modernize the cities, to bring more and more development to them. But the emphasis on high quality development, I think, should definitely get people's attention because it is a concerted message that, yes, this is a problem, that development is not always even in China, that it's not always, it's not, some people accuse me of saying, oh, China is just one big, great place to be. And in many ways, it is for the Chinese people. There's been lots of progress. But at the same time, there are contradictions. There are issues that arise when you're trying to balance models and balance development projects that don't always go together, right? There's a desire to modernize, to increase the profits of the private sector, and there's also a desire to ensure that people have what they need. That there are always going to be clashes with that. And I think in the housing sector, where Xi Jinping says housing is for speculation, I mean, housing is for living, not speculation. And that, I think, is a huge emphasis, because there are problems in that sector. And even though home ownership is really high in China, it doesn't mean that people aren't struggling, especially people that are trying to come out of extreme poverty and then relative poverty. Doesn't mean that people can afford everything, and that it's parity there for everyone. And so I think that's the emphasis, and that's the vulnerability, because you have the Western media able to try to exploit, as if the West has any reason to talk, with the ways that it throws people out of their homes in massive foreclosure crises that don't happen in China. But at the same time, when costs rise, it means that more and more people don't have the ability to enter into that part of the economy and to benefit from it. And in China, certainly, and the CPC wants to stop that, but it's going to be an ongoing problem that will take many years to resolve, because the world economic situation is not going to get any more simple.
No. I think this is the point where we've been talking for quite a while. I think, Alex, maybe you have things to discuss.
Yeah, were you talking, Danny, when you were talking about the housing crisis? Was that company Evergrande by any chance? Or
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so. I believe it was Evergrande.
Okay. I have a lot of questions here, and I've been looking at the chat and the super chats, and I'll try to crystallize everything to some questions, which will take us hopefully about 30 minutes to get through, 30 minutes. The first question is, why does Soros hate China? What's his beef with China?
Wow, that goes back. That goes back all the way to the Tiananmen incident, actually, because George Soros was leading a foundation there. The name escapes me, but George Soros has been a color revolutionist for quite a long time. And so at that time, in the 1980s, in the late 70s, early 80s, before the Tiananmen incident, his foundation was actually funding a lot of these activists. Now, not all of them, but certainly the most rabidly anti-government of the activists. He was responsible for it. In China, after the Tiananmen incident, said, you have to go, like, you're gone. And so I think that started the basis for the animus, because just similar to Russia, when Putin came at the helm, since that period, right, since the late 1980s into especially the Xi period, China has been letting go of its relationships with these NGOs because of the interference that they come with. And so I think that's the root cause. But George Soros is also a rabid neoliberal, and he is not happy that China is not just reorienting itself, redefining what opening up and reform is. He's mad that opening up and reform hasn't achieved the objectives that the U.S. and that people like him thought they would. Remember, China did not suffer like most of the Asian economies during the financial crisis that basically he helped cause, right? The crisis, the Asia financial crisis. And also, China did not collapse during the 2007-2008 crisis. And many of these forces that have invested in China, a lot of the corporations, especially those on the neoliberal end, even though they would talk about, how great it was, like Bill Clinton used to fawn over how great it was that they had close relations. But you would also hear people saying in the same administrations like that, well, the hope is that China will open up completely, that it will become a Western-style democracy because it'll be exposed to our economic way of life. So, of course, it's going to collapse. Like, that was ultimately the objective. And so George Soros thought the same. He thought that, okay, China's opening up and reforming and doing business with the West, that it will collapse in so many years. Xi Jinping, I think, represents, because I don't think Soros is very well, I don't think he knows China that well. I don't think he studied the history. I don't think he knows many Chinese people. So I think, in my estimation, what he sees is that Xi Jinping, because he's waging an anti-corruption campaign, because he's talking about reform and opening up with an emphasis on China's sovereignty, and also with doing things like increasing regulation and tightening up how the CPC and how the government relates to its foreign investors. Because of that, I think it's caused a lot of anxiety for George Soros, and has, I think, basically made him lose his mind a bit. I mean, I already think that he's probably at that level at this point in his life. But to see Xi Jinping talk, for example, at the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China and say things like, you know, China is for China, and we're going to pursue socialism with Chinese characteristics, and that will mean our goals first, not yours. That is very triggering to someone like George Soros, who wants to see China open up to the point where Western investors dominate. And I've written about this, like in the high-speed rail sector, which China dominates worldwide. It's a state-led, directed infrastructure project and policy that has been massively successful. You have 35,000 plus kilometers of high-speed rail in China. Well, a lot of people on the Soros end of the neoliberal economic spectrum, they want their companies to control that market, not because they want to see high-speed rail grow, because they want to make a lot of money off of it. So they lament about how this is just a money suck and there's no profits being made and there's just so much debt. And that's because they just want to steal the revenue that is generated by something like high-speed rail, and they can't even build it themselves because they don't want to lay down the capital, the money. It takes a lot of money to buy the technology to build high-speed rail. So I think that mentality of China's not allowing us to do what we do in other countries, to do what we do across the African continent, across the Caribbean, across Latin America. They're not letting us do that. And so Xi Jinping is just this dictator now who's just like Mao, right? That's the conclusion, rather than understanding, well, it might be because of your own deficits and lack of anything to offer.
Right.